Well, ABSA economist Miyelane Maluleke says the data shows South Africa's economy is weak, but not on its knees. I spoke to him a bit earlier this afternoon.
It's a number that must always be seen in the context of where we're actually coming from, which is the first quarter, and we had a number of supply-side shocks. I think the one big one that a lot of people will still remember is the electricity shortages. You remember that in March we had something like 7 straight days of stage 4 load shedding. We had strike activity in the mining sector, gold mining more specifically. And we also had the effects of the drought, I think, sort of spilling over into this year as well. So we saw a big impact of that. I think those supply side effects had a big shock in Q1. So this normalization that we're seeing now in Q2 is a result of some of the supply side shocks not persisting into the second quarter, and more specifically the stabilization in electricity.
So what you're highlighting for us is that this data is done quarter on quarter. So we're looking at the second quarter in relation to the first quarter, and things were so bad in the first quarter, we were coming off a very bad base, that there was bound to be a significant jump when those things return to normal, as you said.
That's absolutely right. And if you look at the underlying data and the GDP, that's where you realize that a big part of what we're seeing here is what a lot of analysts would call base effect. So for instance, we had mining growing by 14.4% in the second quarter, but where we're coming from is in Q1 where we actually had a contraction of about 11%. So a big part of that was really just normalization. Manufacturing was also down about 8% in the first quarter, and in the second quarter also normalized a little bit. And even the utilities space, which was down about 7%, normalizing in a really big way in the second quarter. And I think the point that I'm trying to drive home here is that although 3.1 is a very encouraging number, it was a lot better than we expected. We had a forecast of 2.6. It isn't really the start of a strong cycle. A big part of it is normalization.
Is a more objective measure than year-on-year economic growth? Let's look at that.
That's absolutely right. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, what you see is that growth was actually just 0.9% higher than the second quarter last year, which is also still a bit of an improvement from Q1. But I think what it still underscores is that overall momentum in economic growth is still quite subdued. And I think if you still look at what the projection for the year as a whole is, our view is that we could actually still come below 1% for 2019.
Okay, but we have avoided recession at least, but what you're saying is the economy is still in the doldrums, basically.
Look, momentum is still weak, but I want to highlight that I think there was a number of things for us in the underlying data that were quite encouraging. Because one of the things that we've been talking about, and I know it's been a big debate over the past week or so since the National Treasury released its discussion document, has been the issue of investment. Right, and private sector investment in particular, which has been quite weak against a backdrop of very low business sector confidence. And one thing that we did see in the second quarter data was that there was actually a bit of a pickup in private sector fixed investment of about 15%. I suspect that some of it is probably going to prove to be one-off effects, but it seems that we seem to turn the corner a little bit to some degree. And I think it'll be key to see going forward if this momentum is sustained, because this will be critical to driving growth going forward.
So this is interesting because for a long time we've been talking about the investment strike in South Africa. Is it sustainable? You're saying maybe it's once off, or could we start talking about again? I remember a few quarters ago, I think we were saying green shoots, and then suddenly they disappeared. But are there green shoots in the economy right now?
That's right. I think in the context where we've had like so much bad news, so much bad data, we like to highlight.
Cling to anything.
Absolutely, but you're absolutely right. I think the issues that you look at survey-based measures of business sentiment, those are still quite weak. One of the things that we had yesterday is the PMI release for August, which is already giving us an indication of Q3. And that PMI weakened quite sharply in August. It tells you that maybe some of this momentum may not be sustained, but I think we do take what we've seen for the second quarter. One of the things that is still a bit of a concern for us is the global growth cycle. I think it picked up for quite a number of years, but increasingly we're seeing more and more evidence that momentum is slow. slowing. And of course, you still have the China-US trade tensions, which could come back to hurt this year. You still have the risk of Brexit, which we still don't know, what sort of effect is going to have on the global economy. But so far, I think there is a little bit of positive news to take from the Q2 data.
So positive, but we are fighting a war on both fronts. So local structural issues that the Treasury is trying to address, a lot of mixed reviews on that sort of economic plan, and then the global issues as well. It's a very difficult space to be in. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. But I think for me, the key thing is to realize that Q2 is not the start of a cycle. Growth story is still quite weak, and I think as we've already seen from the Q2 employment data, that this growth that we're seeing is not sufficient to make a meaningful dent on our unemployment situation, which is why our unemployment rate went up to 29% in this quarter, where we had this rebound of 3.1%. That thinking about the kind of structural reforms, the kind of interventions that are going to lift potential growth in South Africa remains as urgent as it always been, despite this rebound.
And the big question, I mean, is this good news enough to change some of the rhetoric? For example, the fears around a rating downgrade, or even a possible bailout at the IMF. It sounds like no.
Look, our view has always been that this story about a possible IMF blowout bailout is a little bit exaggerated, because South Africa right now does not have any problems meeting its financing requirements. But your question about credit ratings agencies, the stronger than expected rebound certainly does help. But what ratings agencies will still be more interested in is what is the growth story going forward and what supports that. And even more importantly, do we see the kind of SOC reform that we need in South Africa to stabilize some of our troubled state-owned enterprises? And what do we do to stabilize public finances? Because as we've seen, South Africa has been accumulating debt fairly rapidly over the last decade or so. And obviously with that comes interest repayments that have to take away from resources that should be channeled towards other economic